Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Phantom Lighthouse. The Isle of Wight, rugged and isolated, stood firm against the relentless tides that battered its shores. In the midst of this treacherous coast, perched atop a jagged cliff, stood the ancient Blackstone Lighthouse. Its light had guided many ships through the perilous waters of the English Channel for centuries. But in recent years, something sinister had been haunting its beam, something that only the lighthouse keeper, Holly Arnold, seemed to notice. Holly had grown up hearing tales of the Phantom Lighthouse, a whispered legend passed down through generations of islanders. According to the stories, Blackstone had once been a twin lighthouse. The second tower, now long gone, had been swept away during a cataclysmic storm in the late 1800s. Ever since, sailors spoke of a ghostly beacon that flickered in the distance during the most violent storms, a lighthouse that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. Holly had always dismissed the stories as local folklore. She had taken the job of lighthouse keeper not for any sense of adventure, but for the solitude it offered. After a messy breakup and the death of her mother, she had needed to get away, to escape the noise of the mainland and the suffocating memories. The lighthouse offered her sanctuary, a place where she could be alone with her thoughts, away from the world. But as autumn set and the weather worsened, she started to notice strange things. It began with the storms. The Isle of Wight was no stranger to rough seas, but the storms that raged in the last few weeks were unlike anything Holly had ever experienced. They came without warning, with winds that howled like banshees and waves that slammed against the cliffs with terrifying force. Each time, the sky would darken unnaturally, the air would grow thick, and Holly would feel an oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. And then there were the shipwrecks. Twice, during the fiercest storms, Holly had seen ships, a hulking cargo vessel, and later, an old fishing trawler drift dangerously close to the rocks below. She had scrambled to send out warnings, lighting the beacon and signaling the Coast Guard. Yet each time the ships vanished before they could crash, disappearing into the storm like phantoms. One night, during the worst storm yet, Holly saw it. She was watching the raging seas from the lighthouse window, her hands clenched around her mug of tea, when the light appeared. At first, she thought it was a trick of the storm, a flash of lightning, or the reflection of her own beam on the waves. But it was steady, unwavering. A flickering light far in the distance, somewhere beyond the horizon. A second lighthouse. Her heart pounded in her chest. It wasn't possible. She knew the coast like the back of her hand. There were no other lighthouses near Blackstone, especially not one that far out at sea. And yet there it was, shining faintly through the rain, a beacon calling to ships in the dead of night. Without thinking, Holly grabbed her coat and ran outside, the wind nearly knocking her off her feet as she made her way toward the cliffs. The rain stung her skin like icy needles, and the roar of the sea was deafening. But through the chaos, she could still see that phantom light, flickering like a warning from the past. As she approached the edge of the cliff, something caught her eye. A figure, barely visible in the storm, standing at the very edge, looking out to sea. "Teh!" Holly shouted over the wind, her voice barely carrying. The figure didn't move. She squinted, wiping the rain from her eyes. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned lighthouse keeper's uniform, his face obscured by the brim of his cap. He stood motionless, staring out at the phantom light. Holly called again, stepping closer. The man slowly turned to face her, and Holly's blood ran cold. His eyes were hollow, empty black sockets staring straight through her. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his lips were twisted into a grotesque grin. He raised one hand, pointing toward the phantom light in the distance. Before Holly could react, the figure dissolved into the storm, vanishing as if he had never been there. Terrified, Holly stumbled back toward the lighthouse, her mind racing. Who was he? Was he real, or was she losing her grip on reality? The legends of the Phantom Lighthouse echoed in her mind, the stories of ghostly keepers and lost ships, of a beacon that guided sailors to their doom. She locked herself in the lighthouse, her heart hammering in her chest as she tried to calm down. But the storm raged on, and so did the light flickering, calling to her. That night Holly barely slept. She stayed by the window, watching the phantom light until dawn, when it finally faded with the rising sun. But the questions remained. What was that light? And who was the ghostly figure she had seen? Over the following nights the phantom light appeared again and again, always during the worst storms. Each time Holly saw the ghostly figure on the cliffs, pointing out to sea as if beckoning her to follow. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But the more she ignored it, the stronger the pull became. And then came the night she could no longer resist. The storm that night was the worst yet. The wind screamed through the cracks in the lighthouse walls, and the rain battered the windows with relentless fury. Holly sat by the radio, listening to the frantic calls of ships caught in the tempest. But amidst the chaos there was another sound, a low, mournful wail, like the cry of a lost soul. The phantom light appeared again, brighter than ever before. And this time the ghostly figure was not alone. Dozens of shadowy figures stood along the cliff's edge, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted in anguish. They raised their arms, pointing toward the light, urging Holly to join them. She couldn't take it any more. Grabbing her coat, she rushed outside, stumbling through the storm toward the cliffs. The figures loomed before her, silent and accusing, their faces a blur of torment and despair. The phantom light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the jagged rocks below. And then she saw a ship, caught in the storm, heading straight for the rocks. Holly screamed, waving her arms, trying to signal the ship to turn away. But the ghostly figures surrounded her, their cold hands gripping her arms, pulling her toward the edge. Holly cried, struggling against them. I have to stop them. They dragged her closer and closer to the cliff's edge, their hollow eyes fixed on the ship below. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath her feet. With a scream, Holly plummeted into the darkness, the ghostly faces fading as she fell. When she hit the water, the cold was like a shock to her system. She gasped for air, the waves dragging her under, pulling her into the depths. But even as the sea claimed her, she saw the ship shattered against the rocks, its crew lost to the storm. And above it all, the phantom light flickered, guiding the doomed to their watery graves. Days later, when the storm had passed, the Coast Guard found Holly's body washed up on the shore, her lifeless eyes staring out to sea. They buried her in a small cemetery near the lighthouse, where the graves of countless other lighthouse keepers lay. But some say, on stormy nights, if you stand on the cliffs of Blackstone and look out to sea, you can still see her, Holly Arnold, the last keeper of the Phantom Lighthouse, standing with the other lost souls, pointing toward the light that should never have been. And the ships? They still come, drawn by the phantom beacon. They sail into the storm, never to be seen again. Years passed, and the legend of Holly Arnold and the Phantom Lighthouse became another tale whispered among the islanders, a ghost story told to scare children and tourists who visited the Isle of Wight. Yet for those who knew the sea well, the story was more than a cautionary tale. Fishermen and sailors alike spoke of strange lights that would appear during the deadliest storms, luring ships to their doom. One evening, a young couple named Sam and Claire visited Blackstone, unaware of the lighthouse's dark history. They had come to escape the bustle of the mainland, seeking a quiet getaway along the rugged coastline. Blackstone Lighthouse had been abandoned after Holly's death, its beam extinguished, the doors locked tight to keep the curious away. But it was the perfect spot for an adventure. As the couple hiked toward the cliffs, the weather began to shift. Dark clouds rolled in from the horizon, casting an eerie shadow over the land. Claire hesitated, glancing at the sky. "Maybe we should head back," she said. Sam shrugged it off. "It's just a bit of rain. Come on, we've come all this way. Let's get a closer look at the lighthouse. Think of the view." But as they neared the abandoned lighthouse, the air grew colder. The wind that had whipped at their backs just moments ago fell dead, and the sea below churned in ominous silence. "I don't like this," Claire whispered. It loomed before them like a century of forgotten tragedies, its towering presence casting long shadows against the cliff's edge. "It feels wrong." Still, curiosity tugged at him. There was something about the lighthouse, something magnetic. He stepped closer, ignoring the rising sense of dread that built in his chest. The wind howled suddenly, and Claire grabbed his arm. "Oh, Sam, look," she gasped. At first, Sam didn't see it. But then, as the storm clouds gathered, a faint flicker appeared on the horizon. A light. "Is that?" Sam asked, squinting. "But there's nothing out there." Claire's breath hitched as she recalled an old legend she had once heard from her grandmother. "It can't be. It's the Phantom Lighthouse," Sam chuckled. "You kidding? Right, that's just a story." Claire shook her head. "No, Sam, my grandmother used to say that during the worst storms, a ghostly light appears where the old lighthouse once stood. It lures ships to the rocks, just like in the story of Holly Arnold." As she spoke, the flickering light grew stronger. And then they saw it, a ship in the distance, its outline barely visible through the rising fog. It sailed straight toward the cliffs, drawn by the phantom light. Claire shouted, panic gripping her as she tugged at Sam's arm. "They're going to crash." Without thinking, they raced toward the cliffs, but the closer they got, the wind roared to life again, almost as if the storm itself was trying to keep them away. The ground seemed to shift beneath their feet, and a deep rumble echoed from below like the voice of the sea itself. Suddenly, Sam froze. "Oh, Claire," he said. She turned to follow his gaze, and her blood ran cold. Figures, shadowy, indistinct figures, stood at the edge of the cliffs. Dozens of them. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, and their arms raised in unison, pointing out toward the sea. At the center of them stood a woman, her hair wild, her eyes dark as the stormy sky. Holly Arnold. Claire's heart pounded as the ghostly keeper slowly turned toward them, her empty gaze piercing through the rain. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Claire felt a wave of overwhelming grief wash over her, grief, despair, and the unbearable weight of all those lost souls. "She's trying to stop us," Claire whispered. But Sam wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the phantom light, and with each passing second, he seemed to fall deeper under its spell. "We have to stop the ship," he muttered. "We can't let them wreck." He moved toward the cliff edge, his steps slow, mechanical. "Sam!" Claire screamed, grabbing his arm and pulling him back with all her strength. But the pull was too strong, and Sam's eyes were glazed, unfocused. "Snap out of it!" The ghostly figures moved closer. Claire's heart raced as she glanced back at Holly, who stood motionless among the dead, her face expressionless. And then Holly spoke. "You cannot save them," her voice echoed. "No one can." Sam's body jerked, and he tore himself from Claire's grasp. Desperation seized Claire as she lunged after him, grabbing his coat just as he teetered over the precipice. Claire cried, her voice breaking. "Holly, stop this!" "Let him go!" Holly's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, the ghostly lighthouse keeper stared at Claire, something unreadable passing across her face. Was it pity? Regret? Then, with a flick of her wrist, the figures dissolved into the storm, vanishing like mist. The phantom light flickered one last time before extinguishing entirely, leaving only the raging storm in its wake. Sam collapsed to the ground, gasping for air as if he had been drowning. Claire knelt beside him, her heart racing, her body shaking from fear and cold. For a long moment they just sat there, the storm howling around them, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Holly Arnold and her spectral companions were gone, but the Phantom Lighthouse would always remain, lurking just beyond the horizon, waiting for the next storm to rise and for the next ship to fall under its cursed spell. After that night, Sam and Claire never spoke of what they had seen. They left the Isle of Wight, shaken by the experience, and vowed never to return. But deep down, Claire knew that Blackstone Lighthouse was not finished with them. The island had a way of calling people back whether they wanted to come or not. And somewhere, on a stormy night, the phantom light still flickers in the distance, waiting for the lost to heed its deadly call. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like and even better like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.